Well, that's why we're so gracious with each other, because we get along so well. I'll go ahead second. You know, and we've had a number of conversations, and there's an awful lot going on. So I'm going to try and give you sort of a more topical, high-level sense of some of the pieces of what we're doing, and then we can, in question and answer, really focus on whatever's of most interest.
State, for those, you know, Felicia Marcus, chair of the State Water Board, and I'm saying that because we're being televised.
Oh, right, thank you. I'm sorry. See, I'm not even taking my own advice from when I run meetings, so sorry about that. I do think it bears repeating. I appreciated Director Cowan's point about December hope. I shared it too, even as I was out there telling people it ain't over till it's over. And I think the challenge that we're in is that we're in the drought of our lives, but it's not the drought of historical record. And we know it's not even the drought of our lives if you go to Australia or Brazil. And so we know that this drought may continue to last. It may end, but there's no way of knowing. And so I think the big difference that you're seeing this year, even though we hopped on it early, relatively speaking, compared to other places last year, a little bit earlier, is just that we have to act as if it won't rain next year and the year after, even though that's outside the experience that we've had in the past 100 years. And that does require some different approaches and some bold decisions, some of which is continuing the work we started last year, although at a more refined level, certainly with an even better working relationship among the state agencies and with our federal partners, and most importantly with the tremendous addition of not only the Water Action Plan that the administration put out a little over a year ago, but with Proposition 1, which you all put on the ballot and the voters passed. So we now have resources to deal with some issues that are important to us in the long term, but also helpful in the short term. Every state agency has assumed responsibility, and frequently we talk at the water agency level, those of us that touch water more often. I'm glad the CEC is here and glad that they're picking up on a number of the initiatives in the executive order, and it's a tremendous addition to the team. But I'll remind you, there are also agencies that are delivering food boxes to communities in need, and that every agency gets together, a whole range of us at our drought task force meeting. So it's certainly more than the 3, 4, or 5 of us. The Water Board is at the center of a lot of different actions because of the nature of what we do, both our water rights division, our drinking water division, which you all gave to us in the last year, our water quality division, and our division of financial assistance. So I'll just highlight some of those issues just so that you can come back to that in the Q&A more as an overview. Obviously, in water rights, there's a lot of very dramatic efforts, some terrible choices to be made, and some very harsh rules to implement. The water rights system is a seniority-based system, and our water rights division has been issuing curtailments last year, issued some others to junior water rights holders last week, and we anticipate, given the hydrology, which is just the nature of the supply and demand curves on our natural water courses, we will be going up into senior water rights holders who have not been touched before. They were, in part, there were orders issued in 1977, but we had very little ability to actually implement or enforce those. This year it's worse, so it will go much further, and you all have given us additional enforcement abilities. And so, as painful as it is, we will be faithfully implementing the water rights system for the state of California. Also, a number of adjustments. Director Cowan talked about some of them. Some of the dialogue around those generate more heat than light, unfortunately, but those are decisions that our executive director makes under his temporary urgency change authority. We will be holding another hearing on those in our next May 20th workshop. Those are up on protest, so I can't talk about the details much. I can talk about the fact, but not my opinion, or actually theoretically hear yours either. So you may want to ask him to come back, but I can't talk about last year if you're interested in the mechanisms. The other thing we've done is gone out to get better data. and better information. We've issued emergency information orders. We've had a spectacular compliance rate where folks are giving us not just what we have, the face value of their water rights, but actually what did they use last year, what do they expect to use this year, which is particularly important because it will allow us to do curtailments with a level of precision where we're not over-curtailing or under-curtailing, which is what we're trying to do. We've also asked folks for their basis of right to deal with certain conflicts among water rights holders. That will take some people a little bit longer, but we basically have had very good cooperation. People who are concerned about it, but much better cooperation, engagement, and multiple stakeholder meetings, much better than last year, and we're hoping to discharge our responsibilities there. In drinking water, thanks to the administration and to you, we have been similar to our partners at DWR and OES with the individual communities and the other 15, we have been delivering money to help with the public water supply systems over 15, which can be very small, that we work with, and we've expended millions of dollars in helping them with running pipe, drilling wells, delivering water in bottles, vending machines, tanks, you name it, similar to what Director Cowan talked about for the folks who aren't served by public water supply systems under 15. And in our water quality division, we've done a lot to try and accelerate dollars and streamline permitting for recycled water, which after conservation is our fastest way to get more water out there. We've done streamlined permits for groundwater recharge that the Drinking Water Division did just before moving over to us last July. We have streamlined permits for recycled water to agriculture and outdoor uses, and we've put out millions of dollars in low-cost financing to accelerate those projects that have been on the drawing boards and get them in the ground, and we are working quickly to do the next round of recycled water regs, which would be for indirect potable reuse, surface water augmentation that a number of communities are looking towards, as well as feasibility of direct potable. So it's pedal to the metal on those. We're also looking at ways to accelerate the capture of stormwater for the same reasons, and you all have spent a lot of time on this. We're doing some of it in the context of some permit appeals from the city or the County of Los Angeles MS4 permit. Again, I can't talk about the details of it, but just know it is in process, as well as developing our stormwater strategy to figure out how we can be a partner in making those very good projects on the ground happen faster and thoughtfully. And again, part of our role, and probably my favorite part of our role, although perhaps the most misunderstood, is in our water quality standard setting process, where we balance all beneficial uses. We don't get to pick and choose one and ignore the rest. We have to find that sweet spot between all beneficial uses of water, and that plays into the temporary urgency change orders that I talked about earlier. That's where our water quality and our water rights role come together. And then finally, our Division of Financial Assistance is fully committed to expediting getting money out the door, both that you've given in the budget and the Prop 1 dollars we've done. I'll put them in two categories: for wastewater and drinking water, primarily for disadvantaged communities, and for our recycling. We've done a whole series of our workshops as required. Under law, we anticipate being able to get that money out the door this summer, June through August. We'll be able to start, and what we did is streamline our application process, so it's just one application, and then our folks at the Division of Financial Assistance, who get very high marks, have been working with communities to figure out the best mix of state revolving fund money, which we have a AAA rating and implement very well, and the grant monies that we will have to leverage the greatest amount of water production, also conscious of the needs of disadvantaged communities. The two other buckets in the proposition, both for stormwater money and groundwater contamination, are on a slightly longer timeline, but we are committed to expediting that in any way we can. It's a slightly later timeline, in part because of your legislation, where they need to get stormwater plans in, and we're looking at expediting that process and setting out guidance so that that whole process can move more quickly. And in the groundwater contamination, figuring out how to allocate that money in a way that's transparent, fair, and leverages the greatest amount of cleanup in the most places that's going to yield water use. There are a whole host of places, as we've talked about in other hearings, in the Central Valley with nitrate contamination. That money can go to them. There's also issues of contamination in the urban context that you've also given us some other funding sources for. We're trying to figure out how to leverage that, get it out the door, but get it out the door in an intelligent, equitable, and effective way. One last thing I'll mention. that sort of is on top of all of that, and that is the mandatory conservation regulations that the governor gave us the authority to do last year, and then renewed with greater direction April 1st. We've had those regulations at a sort of mild level for about 9 months after voluntary calls didn't yield enough. We got about 9% overall, although some communities did spectacularly, others did not. And then our mandatory conservation regs came out that allocates 25% across communities based on how they're doing, pretty much. It rewards those people who have saved more over the decades or even in the past year and a half with a lower tier percentage. Those who use more have to conserve more, but they still don't have to conserve down to the level that folks have gotten to over decades. We tried to find, again, that sweet spot that was fair but doable, and we're continuing to work with a number of the water agencies on some lingering issues that we just couldn't get done in a very rapid 30-day turnaround with an incredible amount of participation on the part of water agencies who really stepped up to help us do this. So there were plenty of people who were happy with us, some people who thought we could have done better, and we're continuing to work with them. The most important thing in that is that people conserve now in the summer months because so much water is used outdoors, particularly on ornamental landscaping. So it was important to move quickly so that people turn off those sprinklers and put their lawns in particular on a water diet. That's where we'll save the water, which will extend, and I want to emphasize this because some people have been confused at the purpose. The purposes of this is to extend our large urban area resiliency in the face of a multiple-year drought. We do not want to be Sao Paulo, where they just have to turn the water off because they didn't engage the public early. They didn't want to inconvenience them, and they're just turning the water off for hours at a time. Eventually, it'll probably be days at a time. And we don't want to be in the situation that our Australian friends tell us to avoid, where by waiting to conserve as the drought goes on, you have to spend millions, if not billions more to do emergency facilities that would have been less expensive and perhaps more thoughtfully designed over time. This conservation will buy the time to get that recycled water infrastructure in, which is the next cheapest thing, and it's sitting there right now, as well as stormwater capture and the like. And so we're trying to ring the bell so that we are thoughtfully stewarding our resources, even as we make the transition that we know we need to make in the long term as per the Water Action Plan in the face of climate change.
There's going to be some follow-up questions in just a minute on that. So thank you very much. And I'm going to want the last two gentlemen to make some comments before I open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Chair.
Director Bonham, thank you very much from Department of Fish and Wildlife.
And the Chair of the Energy Commission will close for our panel today. So my name is Chuck Bonham. I'm the Director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'd like to quickly tell you how the department is doing relative to the existing executive orders, then give you a snapshot summary of the status of fish and wildlife in the state, and end with a description of the things we're doing or have done responsive to your trust that you've put in us. So the most recent executive order from the governor occurred April 1st. That executive order mostly deals more with the Department of Water Resources, Water Board, Energy Commission around water conservation. It relates to our department in a couple of more limited ways. The first, I think, is a connection to the Senate Democratic letter to the administration about practicing what you preach. There's an element asking for state agencies to achieve conservation. There, our department will be doing better. I have reprioritized funds to begin to address some of our own deferred maintenance problem. We have a pretty vast physical infrastructure system, and we will be turning over about 2,000 toilets and metering 44 facilities which are currently non-metered. In addition, we've done an assessment, and we've uncovered a potential leak at one of our larger multi-use facilities. We're in discussions with the local water utility. We have examined it. We have not uncovered the leak. It could be a metering problem, but with these actions, we're going to meet or exceed 20% conservation by a year from now, and I'm pretty intent on that personally. Also, relative to the most recent executive order, we've gone and rostered those projects that may relate to water efficiencies or supply and their nexus to us on permitting. We have a sense of where they are in the approval discussion pipeline, and we're managing that task as well. Let me remind you, though, that there were two earlier executive orders, one in January of 2014 that had two provisions for our department: begin monitoring the state and assessing impact to fish and wildlife. That was paragraph 14. And then close fishing where appropriate in coordination with the Fish and Game Commission. Then in April of 2014, another executive order was issued. It had three provisions for us. First, begin an emergency kind of all hands on deck monitoring of winter run Chinook in the Sacramento system. Second, begin restoration projects on public lands to improve condition for species. And third, start a voluntary program with landowners around the state to manage species and water use collaboratively. Let me turn to a status of fish and wildlife and do what I typically do. There is no question this drought is producing real, substantial human impact. So my comments about fish and wildlife impacts aren't to diminish the human impacts, but to give a sense of how this drought is affecting all of us. W.H. Auden wrote that thousands have lived without love, but not one without water. It's also very true for fish and wildlife. So in a quick tour of about the last year, in January of 14, we closed fishing for the first time in the state in some waters because of low water conditions. In April of 14, we, with our federal partners, moved about 30 million salmon from our combined hatchery system out of the system to the bay because the river conditions were too lethal and we worried about a dramatic loss of that hatchery production. We evacuated in June of last year our own hatcheries because the water coming in from Folsom Lake was too warm, so we moved about 500,000 salmon and steelhead fingerlings out. From then to now, we've had about 103 staff involved in 300+ fish rescues around the state in 25 watersheds. It's about 5,000 person hours, we think. Just in the Scott and Shasta tributaries, we moved 150,000 highly imperiled coho from drier spots in the watershed to wetter spots. For the McCloud River red brand, and really iconic native trout, our staff brought about 1,000 into the oldest hatchery that's continuously operated west of the Mississippi, the Mount Shasta hatchery, and they have refused to feed those fish regular hatchery trout feed. They've set up bug zappers on the property, and they're zapping native bugs to feed these native trout, to hold them over until we can get them back into their watershed. We've been managing scientific protocols in the Delta for longer than I've been alive to understand abundance of Delta smelt. We do a fall midwater trawl. At the end of last year, we picked up the lowest recorded number of Delta smelt, 9, the second lowest number recorded of longfin smelt, 16. Now, these are not true population surveys. We're not looking everywhere. What we're doing is looking in identified places year after year for about 47-something years and seeing what we get at that moment in time. We also do a spring series of surveys, which we've just completed. We've been doing those since 2002. They're better gear type. And in March, we found 6 Delta smelt. A year before, it was 88. In April, we found 1. A year before, it was 36. In the Russian River, we believe we've lost about 90% of our coho return. And in the Sacramento River, we concluded that in our 2014 brood year, meaning the parental class, we had about a 95% mortality rate in our fry and eggs. Those are the species that are migratory. Now let's turn to those that can't move as well, like the giant garter snake, or some of our lizards, or the Washington Post ran a great story last week about the kangaroo rat on the Carrizo Plain, which is food for the food chain. San Joaquin kit fox eat them, other predators eat the kit fox. Typically, we'd have about 60% grassland habitat available this time of year. Academics who are surveying down there tell us that grassland is dried up and we have only about 18% grassland food productivity for the kangaroo rat as of right now. Birds. We dodged one this winter. So January is particularly a peak season for us. We'd have about 5 million birds. Habitat was shrinking. The December rains lessened some of that pressure. We would typically have about 300,000 acres of rice flooded up for bird habitat. Maybe this year we got about 50 or 100,000 acres. What have we done? Well, with my current budget and what you did in March of this year, the legislature and the administration will have appropriated about $54 million across 2 fiscal years, 38 million current budget, 16 million go forward for emergency drought actions. Okay? We have that spread across actions like emergency monitoring and rescues, statewide contingency planning, commercial fishery hatchery management, law enforcement, our own lands, and a human-wildlife interface. We usually in the Bakersfield area get 10 calls about bears. We got about 100 calls last year, and we moved about a dozen bears from the greater Bakersfield area. We already know that we've got about 22 black bear cubs in rehabilitation that have come in this winter, usually less than 10. So we predict a continuing interface between animals and humans as animals are moving farther for food and water. We've put about 600 acoustic tags across our salmon. We've networked the whole upper Sacramento with real-time temperature sensors to help us manage the water temperature better. We've restored about 1,000 acres of our own property in the Delta, doubling the size of tidal marsh in the Suisun area. We're posting online quarterly reports on our website, tracking each expenditure of the 38 million. Our burn rate right now is we've spent about 70% of that 38 million. We have a couple of large expenditures left, and we think we'll get that done by the end of June. Let me turn to Prop 1 and then wrap up. Our goal is to be approving our first round of grants by the end of this calendar year under Proposition 1, which will mean in 6 months of next year's budget and in 12 calendar months, we will have built a granting program, gone out for workshops, which we've already done, published our draft guidelines, which we did in February, take feedback, work on a solicitation, which we intend to publish by July 1, receive applications, go through 4 rounds of technical review, and approve. We know that's doable because we just did the same timeline under 12 months on our first granting under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. About 10 days ago, we announced $21 million and 12 projects being awarded in less than a year of work. We have 50 contingency plans on our own properties. We own and manage about 1 million acres. I'm a contractor as well. I've received substantial reductions of our own deliveries from the Bureau of Reclamation. We now have 50 contingency plans across about 300,000 acres, reducing our own use on our own properties. And we've entered into over 20 voluntary drought initiatives around the state, including with our largest landowner in the state, Mr. Red Emerson, where parties are willing to give us access to their properties in exchange for us providing incidental take coverage for a defined time frame so we can move fish and ensure minimal flows in certain spots to help us all make it through this drought.
And if
I'll stop there
yes,
and ask
thank
for
you.
the chair to
Perfect.
conclude.
As we'll run out of time here. So our last speaker, Robert Weisenbiller, he's chair of the California Energy Commission, and I'm glad to hear that the Energy Commission is working in the water world, because we're hoping that water and energy will work collaboratively together so we can accomplish 2 goals, reducing water consumption as well as GHGs.
Yes.
Welcome.
Let me provide some brief comments today and talk about the 4 elements of the executive order that we're responsible for. Let me start by talking about the water energy nexus. I think people generally realize that about 20% of our energy use is to move water around the state, and at the same time, water or hydro provides about 15 to 19% of our power. And so let me just start with a note. Obviously, the hydro generation is going to be about half of what it typically is. But looking at this summer, we feel that we have enough other supplies that we're not concerned about power reliability. In terms of one example, since 2012, the amount of wind and solar generation we have has gone up 2.5%, or 2.5 times as much as then. So again, we've had a real boost in solar and wind at a time when the hydro is dropping off, and we need that. But again, I think in terms of, obviously, we never want to be complacent, but we're not concerned at this point about power this summer. So talking about the 4 programs we were responsible under the executive order, the first thing is we were directed to expedite the adoption of water efficiency standards for appliances. And we did that at our next business meeting following the executive order. So they're now adopted. They will go into effect on January 1, which is somewhat expedited, but given the nature of the times, we thought it was important to do that. Along with that order, the other part was we were also directed to come up with ways to simplify for our power plants compliance. Some of our power plants need water for cooling, and our permits specify exactly where the water has to come from. And so given the current situation, some of those supplies are just not going to be there. And so we put in place we're considering at our next business meeting tomorrow, essentially delegating to our executive director, making those adjustments in our permit conditions where we need to. We will also obviously mitigate the impacts of those changes, but we wanted to make sure we can move in a timely fashion, particularly if this drought goes into next summer. Is probably when I'm more concerned about having a number of those cases pending. The last 2 things we were directed to do, and one of them is to put in place a rebate program for water efficient appliances. As the chair noted, we want to save water, energy, and greenhouse gas emissions, and so we will put in place a rebate program for residential appliances. And we now have on our website at least the preliminary details. We'll be discussing that more with you after the May revise. Now, in addition, we were directed to put in place a program to encourage innovative technologies in the area of water and energy. And again, we want to come up with things which will save water, thus save energy, and thus save greenhouse gases. Again, we're looking for innovative technologies that are really available now, but in wide use. And so we're going to try to really move those more broadly out. We're going to start with agriculture, then go on to industrial, residential, and commercial, and then look at the combination of renewables and desalinization. Again, we have details on that program on our website. Those one-pagers are both in English and Spanish. And we will have broader discussions with you as we go through the budget process on the details. We will obviously have public hearings, and we have been working very closely with the Water Board and Department of Water Resources on these plans.
Very good. Thank you for that. All right. I would like to open it up to members' questions. Anyone on this panel? Looking around, Senator Jackson, followed by Senator Woke. I have a question or two.
First of all, I want to thank you for taking what sound like some very immediate and intelligent, thoughtful steps. I have a couple questions dealing with the fact that the water law in California is either a mess or non-existent, generally speaking. And I know certainly when it comes to groundwater, both the senators here to my left have been working very intensely on creating some sort of system out of this sort of chaos. But I'm kind of curious as to what is being done. I hear stories, whether they're true or not, I'm not sure, but that some of those with our senior and riparian rights are sucking up lots of water and then turning around and selling it to desperate and needy areas for huge profits. So they are excuse me, looking at the water crisis as a profit opportunity. And I'm wondering what steps you are taking or are considering taking so that they're not able to benefit, or if we can do anything, so that they aren't able to benefit with such high levels of profit for basically holding the rest of the state, I don't want to say hostage. I mean, they have those rights at this point, as I understand it. But what are we doing so that we can start either distributing that water more equitably? We talk about areas where they have no water or they have to use bottled water, tend to be poor areas because whatever water they have, the quality is so inadequate. I'm just wondering, when it comes to senior water rights and riparian rights, what steps are you taking and do you plan to take to gain better control over the notion that these folks have had either legitimately because of their legal position or just because they can, to really take advantage of this drought for enormous financial gain to the detriment of others?
Answer that question.
Do you want me to start, and then
Sure.
you'll talk about transfers?
Alicia, and then
Great.
Mark.
We'll both take it because both of our agencies are involved, with DWR being more of a lead on the transfer issue, at least particularly for junior water rights. It's an interesting question. Our system is one that is harsh. It's the nature, it's similar to most Western states, less built out, less data rich than most Western states, but similar in construct of the seniority system. And if folks have a right to water, they also have a right to sell that water. And there is a fairly complex process that at least some of them go through to prove up that they actually have those water rights. It's a little different in the case of most senior water rights holders, and then it is really in some ways on the juniors to both decide whether they want to buy it and to run the risk that they're actually going to get it. But at present, as far as I know, we don't have a price control mechanism on that. I have heard of fairly high rates for water, but I haven't heard of ones that are off the scale of what we've seen. They are high, however, and that is in some cases just as some of our desal facilities are also expensive. So it is expensive water that people are purchasing to use frequently on crops that end up either permanent crops or crops that have a high return. And so the person buying the water has made a judgment that that water is of value to them. I don't believe that the water that we're purchasing to be able to deliver to small communities is of that price range. However, I think we aren't going to the most expensive water around, but I don't know for sure. That's something we should be looking at, but I don't have a great answer for you yet. It is an area to look at and then look at tools we might have, but I don't have an answer yet for you or any kind of set of data on how much people are paying where. Director Cowan may know a little bit better.
Director Cowan.
Well, I'll attempt to respond as well, but I think you've really picked a big challenge for California. This is an area that I suspect that maybe the next panel will even want to talk about future policy challenges. And this is another thing. Maybe we can make one of those big lurches forward in light of these drought conditions. But I would start with what would help the situation is more clarity on exactly who holds what water rights and how they're being exercised. Just more information on water use. We've seen incremental steps forward in that area through this drought, but I would hope that a first step in any consideration on revamping our water rights system or simply reinforcing our water rights system starts with a better sense of where water rights are held and how they're being exercised. My department has responsibility for moving transferred water in some cases and also for approving transfers. Part of our challenge, of course, is that there are a number of different bureaucratic steps involved in getting that work done. I think over the last couple of years, we've made pretty good progress in clearing away some of the red tape so that it's not just institutional problems that are keeping us from getting transfers approved, but more geophysical sorts of issues where we need to better understand what's real wet water engaged in any of these transfers. And whenever there's groundwater involved, there's always some question as to how much is real and how much is just delayed flow in a river. more clarity on water rights. This year, for instance, with so many curtailments, transfers that have been in the making have fallen apart now because the sellers have lost their access to control water supplies. So better able to anticipate how those will play out, all in light of trying to just get to a more transparent market where we can let the market do its thing. Right now, that's the system we have in place in California, willing buyers, willing sellers. If water's going for $1,000 an acre foot, then that's what sellers get. But having more clear information available to all potential buyers and sellers might make for a more equitable market in the future.
And Senator,
I'm sorry, go ahead. I
Did you
did
want to
have,
have, we're going to go on to other members.
I did want to ask, if I may, you know, we're asking the people of California to cut back their use of water. There's a perception out there that says, why should I do it when X, Y, and Z isn't? Why should I do it when we are told that there are these major water-using crops that are being increased and grown and so forth, so that when we ask people to step up to the plate and do their share, there's a concern that not everybody's doing their share. And so people say, well, why should I do mine if X, Y, and Z isn't doing theirs? And I think that that's a perception. I'm trying to, Madam Chair, find out whether that's an accurate perception, and if it is, what we can do to correct the situation. And if it's an inaccurate perception, then how do we correct that inaccuracy? I mean, we're asking the people of California to cut back on their water use dramatically. Take out your lawns, we're saying to urban water users. Don't water your lawns. You know, take short showers. Don't use water. We're going to charge you more for the usage, et cetera. At the same time, we know in some agricultural communities, they're taking a major hit too, but some people aren't, or some groups aren't. So how do we explain that to people, or how do we justify that? Or on the other hand, how do we create policy that makes this a drought and a crisis that everybody has to share? That's and I apologize if, I mean, that's what I need to know to go back to my constituents, because many of them are using less water than any other places of their size in the state. We keep saying, how much more can we cut back? Well, at the same time, we hear that we're producing more almonds and more you know, crops that are ostensibly greater water users. So there's a disconnect here, and I'd like to try to understand what it is so that we can, as policymakers, correct the situation. And I'd appreciate some help.
I'm happy to take a stab at least two cuts at that. Number one, there are two different systems, and you pointed on the fact that many folks in agriculture are doing without agriculture, and rural communities have borne the brunt of this. Asking people to cut back, take shorter showers, and put their lawn on a water diet is very different than fields that are fallowed, thousands of people out of work, people bathing out of buckets. And so the difference is that in the water rights system, et cetera, that is just the system we have. It's very harsh. It's an all or nothing kind of a system. In the urban context, we're dealing with a different issue. It's not that we have one big bucket of water. It'd be great if we were all in this together and you all from a policy standpoint can think about it, but they're two separate systems. And in the urban context, the reason to do it is self-interest. I want folks to do it to step up as Californians in solidarity to those folks in rural communities and those farmers in rural communities who grow the food we eat and the food we eat in urban communities. So separating that math as if folks in agriculture are growing healthy fruits and vegetables just have a bonfire or party with it is something that has been promoted in the media but does us all an incredible disservice, because the water footprint of urban Californians in the food they eat, the food we want them to eat more of, is huge, or the food that people eat in other parts of the nation or the world. And so we're in that phase of a crisis where folks are jumping to a finger pointing, or they're worried something's not fair, which is a natural human place to go. And we do have to help people get over that and rise to the occasion. But the reason for cutting back in urban California is to build resilience in urban California and to make the local supplies that folks have spent a lot of money doing, local supplies or their groundwater basins, last 2 or 3 years longer, so that our urban communities are not in the situation of Sao Paulo, they're not in the situation in the Tulare Basin, they're not in the situation in Bakersfield, and the way to do that is to conserve now, to extend your water resources another couple of years in case it doesn't rain. It's a safer than sorrier approach. It's not a comparison, and it's not about sharing the pain. It's about self-interest in making a judgment that we have to act in urban California as if it won't rain for another couple of years. That's a bold leadership decision on the part of the governor, and I think a prudent one. If you had a bathtub full of water and the water got cut off in an earthquake, you wouldn't use it all in a week. You'd try and make it last as long as you can, and that's the answer back to your constituents.
And I appreciate that. So let's get to the agricultural. I hear what you're saying is there are two separate sets of buckets, if you will. How do we address the agricultural one so that I know folks in these various communities whose lands are lying fallow and others who are making huge profits from this, how do we address that perception, if at all, as policymakers? And that's what I'd like to ask you to focus on, then I'm done.
Well, I'll take a shot at that, Senator. As Felicia points out, it is a harsh system, and within the agricultural community, there are certainly winners and losers based upon the seniority of your water rights or the seniority of your water supply contract. So definitely there will be those that do better than others during water shortages. I guess my perspective is we made a great step forward last year in passing the Groundwater Sustainability Act. This is going to set not only groundwater, but our water supply system in general on a much more sustainable track over time. So we will continue to see some degradation of our groundwater, for instance, during this drought. I think maybe the primary question that ought to be before us now is what should we be doing now to protect our groundwater supplies in advance of implementation of the Groundwater Sustainability Act that will better balance our entire system, and I'm ready to engage in that debate whenever you're ready.